a body rotting while still breathing, skin covered in sores, hair falling out in clumps, and intestines completely burned away by an acid-laced enema. The victim was Sir Thomas Overbury, one of the most brilliant scholars in 17th century England. This horrific death sentence came only because he dared to block a shocking affair between his best friend, the king's favorite, Robert Carr, and a married noblewoman. For trying to stop Carr from marrying the powerful Frances Howard, Overberry was thrown straight into the Tower of London. There were no executioners or beheading orders. Francis used King James I to set a trap, turning that cold cell into a poison lab with arsenic and mercury. This is the true record of power, lust, and one of the most brutal deaths in the Stuart dynasty. In 1603, the English crown passed to King James VI of Scotland after the death of Queen Elizabeth I. James was an educated scholar, yet he was also physically awkward and paranoid about assassination. His governing style was unconventional and driven by personal preference rather than traditional statecraft. He often sidelined experienced politicians to rely on his own inner circle. The king regularly awarded immense wealth and high-ranking titles to young, attractive men. In his court, securing the king's personal favor meant gaining serious political power. Into this appearance-driven world entered Thomas Overbury. He lacked noble titles and sprawling estates, but he used a strategic intellect to navigate the political landscape. Born in 1581 to a wealthy land-owning family in Warwickshire, Thomas Overbury was a product of the English intellectual elite. He was not raised to be a fawning courtier. He was raised to be a rigorous thinker. He received a premier humanist education. He graduated with a Bachelor of Arts from Queen's College, Oxford, in 1598. Seeking to sharpen his mind further, he moved to London. He went on to study law at the prestigious Middle Temple. The Middle Temple was not just a school. It was the epicenter of English jurisprudence, complex rhetoric, and competitive legal philosophy. Here, Overbury immersed himself in the mechanics of the state. He learned how laws were written, how complex treaties were negotiated, and most importantly, how men were manipulated through words. Overbury possessed a razor-sharp intellect and a logical, almost mathematical mind. He understood the hidden machinery of government better than almost anyone of his generation. However, Sir Thomas Overbury was burdened with a fatal character flaw. He was blindingly arrogant. He did not just believe he was intelligent. He genuinely believed he was a singular genius surrounded by incompetence. He lacked basic social tact. He possessed no patience for the delicate diplomatic dances of the royal court. He openly and frequently displayed biting contempt for anyone he deemed less intelligent than himself. In Overbury's mind, this category included almost everyone in the royal court, including the highest-ranking lords of the realm. But intellect alone could not secure absolute power in the court of King James I. Overbury was not beautiful enough to catch the king's eye. He needed a vessel. He needed a physical key to unlock the king's attention. In 1607, during a grand royal event, fate handed Thomas Overbury that exact key on a silver platter. The royal court had gathered at Whitehall Palace. It was a day of massive celebration. The stands surrounding the tilt yard were packed with the nobility of England. King James I sat in the elevated royal box, safely behind velvet curtains, watching the martial pageantry. During the jousting tournament, a striking, athletic young Scottish man rode out onto the dirt field. His name was Robert Carr. Carr was serving in a relatively minor role as a page. He was tasked with presenting a heraldic shield to the king, But as Carr rode his horse forward toward the royal box, disaster struck. The heavy war horse suddenly stumbled. It violently threw the young man to the hard dirt. Robert Carr broke his leg, and crucially, he broke it directly in front of the King of England. King James I looked down at the injured youth in the dirt. The king was immediately captivated. He was struck by the young man's stunning physical looks and his stoic endurance of the pain. King James took Robert Carr under his personal wing. He assigned his own elite royal physicians to tend to the boy's broken leg. As Carr lay recovering in the palace, the king's infatuation grew. James personally took it upon himself to tutor the young man, allegedly teaching him Latin by his bedside. The king quickly knighted him. He showered him with expensive clothing, massive jewels, and direct access to the royal apartments. Virtually overnight, this unknown Scottish youth was transformed into the most powerful favorite at the English court. There was just one glaring vulnerability in this sudden rise to power. Robert Carr was physically beautiful, but he was a political void. Carr was largely uneducated. He was almost completely illiterate in the treacherous ways of English court politics. He did not know how to read a nuanced diplomatic dispatch. He did not know how to negotiate with the cunning Spanish ambassador. In the ruthless arena of Whitehall, he was a beautiful, powerful blank slate. Thomas Overbury watched this meteoric rise with cold calculation. Overberry had actually met Carr a few years prior during a trip to Edinburgh. They shared a pre-existing acquaintance. When Overberry saw Carr standing at the center of the king's attention, he recognized the opportunity of a lifetime. Carr possessed the face. Overberry possessed the brain. Overberry stepped out of the shadows. He approached the new royal favorite. He formally offered to act as Carr's invisible guide, his personal secretary, and his master political strategist. Robert Carr recognized his own intellectual limitations. He was desperate to maintain the king's favor and terrified of making a fatal political mistake. He eagerly accepted Overberry's offer. The two men formed a highly effective parasitic alliance. It was a hostile takeover of the English government, masquerading as a deep friendship. Carr provided the physical magnetism, the athletic charm, and the constant presence necessary to keep King James infatuated. Thomas Overbury did the heavy work of ruling the nation. Operating from a small private office, Overbury steadily seized the hidden reins of the state. He opened the king's classified diplomatic mail before the king even saw it. He drafted complex state policies. He wrote the official responses to foreign monarchs. More importantly, Overbury became the inescapable gatekeeper. He decided exactly which courtiers were granted private audiences with the favorite. By controlling access to Carr, he effectively controlled who had access to the king. He meticulously scripted almost every single political word Robert Carr spoke in public. The political elite of London were not blind. They were seasoned operators who had survived the Tudors. They quickly realized exactly what was happening behind the closed oak doors of Whitehall Palace. A cynical saying began to echo through the dark halls of the court. It was whispered among the highest nobility. Carr rules the king, and Overbury rules Carr. This dynamic granted Thomas Overbury immense power. He was an unelected lawyer from Warwickshire. Yet he was now secretly dictating the foreign and domestic policy of the British Empire. But this hidden authority also planted the dark seeds of a fatal delusion. Overbury began to believe his own myth. He began to believe that he was the undisputed master of the court. He felt untouchable. He felt vastly intellectually superior to the aristocratic lords who were now forced to swallow their pride and beg him for favors. But a shadow king cannot rule unopposed. forever. By monopolizing the king's favorite, Overberry had unwittingly declared war on the oldest, most ruthless political machine in the British Empire. Imagine the visual contrast. On one side, heavily fortified manor houses built on centuries of accumulated wealth, moving in synchronized obedience to the Howard family. On the other, a single commoner sitting in a candlelit office, routinely vetoing the ambitions of those ancient lords. To understand the sheer, crushing weight of the opposition Overberry now faced, we must closely examine this powerful family. In the early 17th century, the Howards were not merely a wealthy family. They were a sprawling, deeply entrenched political monolith. They had survived the bloody executions of the Tudor era. Now, under King James I, they had returned to a state of dominating prominence. The faction was led primarily by two hardened political veterans. The first was Henry Howard, the Earl of Northampton. He was a brilliant, cynical survivor of decades of court intrigue. The second was his powerful nephew, Thomas Howard, the Earl of Suffolk. Together, these two men controlled a vast network of state patronage. The Howards were deeply conservative. They were sympathetic to the old Catholic faith in an officially Protestant country. Most importantly, they harbored an overarching foreign policy objective. They actively sought a binding political alliance with the Spanish Empire. Spain was the undisputed global superpower of the era. It possessed vast colonial wealth and a terrifying military armada. The Howard faction believed that aligning England with Spain would secure permanent international peace. More importantly, it would guarantee their own unchallenged dominance at court. Sir Thomas Overbury stood directly in their way. Overbury was a staunch Protestant. He fiercely opposed any alliance with the Catholic Spanish Empire. Because Overbury completely controlled the mind of Robert Carr, he effectively controlled the ear of the king. He actively blocked the Spanish treaties. As long as Overbury remained the invisible gatekeeper, the Howard family could not push their national agenda forward. The unelected lawyer from Warwickshire had created an impenetrable political bottleneck. He was paralyzing the most powerful lords in the realm. The Howards realized they needed to break Overbury's iron grip on the king's favorite. They needed to pull Robert Carr out of Overbury's shadow and directly into their own sphere of influence. To achieve this political shift, they did not deploy a seasoned diplomat. They deployed their most valuable strategic political asset. Her name was Frances Howard. Frances was the daughter of the Earl of Suffolk. She was born directly into the highest echelon of English society. But in the transactional world of Jacobean politics, aristocratic daughters were not raised for personal independence. They were raised to be highly deployable chess pieces. In 1606, when Frances was only 13 or 14 years old, her powerful family forced her into a political arranged marriage. She was wed to Robert Devereux, the third Earl of Essex. This marriage was orchestrated by King James I himself. It was specifically designed to heal old factional wounds left over from the previous reign. The wedding was a massive state event. It featured elaborate poetry written specifically for the occasion by the famous playwright Ben Jonson. It featured extravagant stage designs by the legendary architect Inigo Jones. But behind the theatrical facade, it was a human tragedy. They were merely children acting out a political treaty. Because of their extreme youth, the marriage was not immediately consummated. Following the lavish ceremony, the young Earl of Essex was sent away. He traveled to the European continent to complete his aristocratic education, tour foreign courts, and learn the military arts. Frances Howard was left behind in London. This prolonged separation proved to be a fatal catalyst for the disaster that followed. While her young husband was away in Europe, Frances grew up entirely within the suffocating confines of the Jacobean royal court. It was a toxic environment for an unsupervised teenager. The court of King James I was notorious across the European continent for its lack of moral boundaries. It was a place of relentless daily drinking. It was defined by lavish midnight masks. It was a world of financial corruption and rampant sexual affairs. Surrounded entirely by this hedonistic atmosphere, Frances matured rapidly. Contemporary chronicles universally agree on one specific point. She blossomed into a stunningly beautiful, fiercely ambitious, and highly intelligent young woman. She learned how to expertly navigate the whispered politics of the palace corridors. She learned the devastating power of her own physical allure. She watched how mistresses gained wealth and influence, and she took careful notes. Then, around 1609, the Earl of Essex finally returned from his European tour. He returned to London expecting to claim his dutiful, obedient teenage bride. He found a completely different woman. Frances Howard took one look at her husband and felt visceral revulsion. Historical accounts suggest that Essex had contracted smallpox while traveling abroad, leaving his face heavily scarred. But beyond his physical appearance, Frances found his personality repulsive. He was rough. He was unrefined. He was entirely devoid of the poetic charm and witty intellect she had grown so accustomed to at the royal court. She deeply despised him. She engaged in a quiet, aggressive domestic rebellion. She consistently refused to consummate their marriage. She locked her doors. She kept the Earl of Essex out of her bed entirely. According to later court testimonies, her desperation reached terrifying extremes. She allegedly sought out the illicit services of a notorious London astrologer and rumored sorcerer named Simon Forman. Surviving documents from Forman's illegal medical practice suggest Frances purchased strange powders and dubious chemical potions. She supposedly slipped these toxic substances directly into her husband's food. She was desperately hoping to physically incapacitate him, to make him terribly ill, and to permanently prevent him from demanding his marital rights. While she physically rejected her husband, Frances set her sights on a much higher target. She looked across the crowded halls of Whitehall Palace. She fixed her gaze on the most powerful man in the Kingdom of England. She chose Robert Carr. Carr was the king's undisputed favorite. He was exceptionally handsome, athletically gifted, and dripping with newly acquired royal wealth. An affair with Carr offered Frances a glamorous escape from her miserable marriage. More importantly, it offered her direct proximity to the ultimate center of state power. When the illicit romance between Frances Howard and Robert Carr first began, Thomas Overbury did not try to stop it. In fact, Overberry made a catastrophic, arrogant miscalculation. He enthusiastically encouraged the affair. Overberry knew that Robert Carr was a political blank slate, but he also knew the man was incredibly vain, insecure, and susceptible to grand flattery. Carr possessed the physical magnetism to attract women, but he completely lacked the refined vocabulary necessary to successfully court a sophisticated noblewoman like Frances Howard. So, Thomas Overbury stepped into the shadows once again. He decided to act as the ultimate cynical ghostwriter. Overbury sat at his heavy wooden desk. He used his educated mind to meticulously craft the poetic, passionate love letters that Carr then sent to Frances Howard. Overbury provided the sophisticated dialogue. He orchestrated the secret late-night meetings. He facilitated the entire treasonous courtship. To Overberry's cold, logical mind, this affair was a brilliant tactical maneuver. Thomas Overbury did not view Frances Howard as a complex human being. He viewed her simply as a convenient pawn. She was a sexual spoil of war. She was utilized to keep his political puppet, Robert Carr, thoroughly happy, entertained, and distracted from the actual work of governing the nation. Furthermore, Overberry firmly believed he was actively gathering massive political ammunition. Having the king's favorite sleep with a prominent, legally married woman from the rival Howard family gave Overberry a significant point of leverage. It was an explosive, scandalous secret. He believed it was a weapon he could hold over the Howards' heads. He believed he could use it to blackmail the Earl of Northampton. He planned to use the affair to humiliate his political rivals and permanently guarantee his own continued supremacy as the shadow king of the court. He thought he was the smartest man in the room. He believed he was completely in control of the entire narrative. He believed he was successfully managing both the King of England and the most powerful aristocratic family in the realm. But Thomas Overbury fundamentally underestimated his opponent. Frances Howard was not a passive, obedient courtier. She was not content to be a hidden mistress, waiting in the shadows for a poetic letter. She was a Howard. She was relentlessly ambitious. And she wanted legitimate, recognized, and permanent power. She did not just want to sleep with Robert Carr in secret. She wanted to legally divorce the Earl of Essex. She wanted to stand before the altar and marry the king's favorite. And she wanted to take full control of the immense power he wielded, absorbing him completely into the Howard political machine. When Thomas Overbury realized the scope of her ambition, the cold logic of his political machine broke down. He realized with mounting horror that the trap he had so arrogantly helped to build was closing tightly around his own neck. The trap of his own arrogance was set. By cynically ghostwriting the passionate love letters, Overbury genuinely thought he was securing his political puppet. Instead, he had awakened a terrifying ambition within Frances Howard. She was no longer a pawn. She was preparing a legal maneuver so brazen that it would soon corrupt the highest courts in the land. Picture two vastly different arenas of justice. On one side, you see the solemn halls of the Church of England, where ancient laws of morality are debated by pious bishops. On the other side, you see a corrupt theatrical circus. You see a room where a young woman hides her face behind a heavy, dark veil, surrounded by a panel of midwives actively participating in a legally binding lie. Outside the doors, politicians hand out bribes and manipulate the verdict to satisfy the carnal desires of the king's favorite. How does the sacred legal institution in the British Empire reduce itself to a fraudulent spectacle? The answer lies in the blinding ambition of Frances Howard and the desperate panic of Sir Thomas Overbury. To understand the absurdity of the legal proceedings that followed, we must understand the rigid nature of marriage in 1613. In the Jacobean era, a noblewoman could not file for divorce due to irreconcilable differences. She could not leave her husband simply because she despised him. Marriage was an unbreakable religious sacrament. To dissolve a royal marriage, one needed a formal annulment from a high ecclesiastical court. The legal grounds for securing an annulment were strict. Frances Howard needed to marry Robert Carr to secure her family's dominance. To achieve this, she deployed a bizarre and humiliating legal strategy against her husband. In the spring of 1613, she formally filed her lawsuit. Her legal grounds rested on a rare canon law concept, impotentia versus hanc. Translated, this meant impotence specifically toward her. Frances Howard publicly claimed that the Earl of Essex was entirely capable of physical intimacy with other women. However, she alleged he was physically impotent when it came to his legally wedded wife. She did not blame this failure on a natural medical condition. The Jacobean court was deeply superstitious. Therefore, Frances alleged this localized impotence was the direct result of a demonic curse. Some historical documents suggest she claimed dark magic had been used to physically bind her husband, preventing him from consummating the marriage. But a claim of witchcraft and impotence was not enough. To secure the annulment, Frances made an audacious declaration to the ecclesiastical judges. She formally declared under oath that she was still a pure, untouched virgin. The English public was captivated. The legal proceedings instantly became a massive media sensation. The entire city of London was gossiping about the Earl's alleged bedroom failures. More importantly, everyone in the High Court knew about Frances Howard's visible affair with Robert Carr. Her solemn claim of absolute physical purity was widely viewed as a transparent lie. But the ecclesiastical court could not simply take her word for it. Legal protocol demanded physical proof. The court ordered a formal physical examination of Frances Howard's body. A panel of respected noblewomen and experienced midwives was assembled. They were tasked with inspecting the Countess and verifying her claim of intact virginity. This specific examination remains one of the most notorious moments in Jacobean history. When the day of the inspection arrived, Frances Howard made a highly unusual demand. She insisted on wearing a thick veil over her face and upper body during the entire examination. She cited her aristocratic modesty as the sole reason. She claimed the humiliation of the inspection was simply too much for a noblewoman to bear with her face exposed. The midwives performed the inspection. They formally reported back to the ecclesiastical court. They swore that the woman they had examined was indeed a biological virgin. However, surviving letters and contemporary diaries reveal a completely different public consensus. Almost no one in London believed the official report. Massive rumors erupted across the capital. Many contemporary gossips and numerous modern historians strongly suspect a brazen deception. It is widely believed that Frances, utilizing the cover of the heavy veil and her family's wealth, had secretly smuggled a young, physically similar virgin substitute into the dimly lit examination room. The midwives were either bribed to look the other way or genuinely fooled by the veiled decoy. Despite the official midwives' report, the annulment panel remained deeply skeptical. The ecclesiastical court was led by George Abbot, the powerful Archbishop of Canterbury. Archbishop Abbot was a strict Protestant. He distrusted the Catholic-leaning Howard family. He saw right through the theatrical absurdity of the witchcraft claims and the veiled examination. Archbishop Abbot bravely refused to grant the annulment. He argued that the legal precedent was flawed. The panel of judges deadlocked. The Howards' political plan was stalled. This is exactly where the true corruption of the Jacobean state violently engaged. King James I was desperate to see his beloved favorite Robert Carr happy. The king could not bear to see Carr frustrated by moral objections or strict legal technicalities. So, the supreme head of the Church of England blatantly intervened in his own justice system. King James I entirely bypassed Archbishop Abbot's authority. The king artificially packed the court. He arbitrarily added 2 compliant bishops to the annulment panel. These new judges were not added to debate the law. They were specifically placed there to deliver a predetermined political verdict. They forced a 5-5 tie-breaking vote entirely in Frances Howard's favor. The annulment was officially granted. The marriage to the Earl of Essex was legally dissolved. Frances Howard was a free woman. She was legally cleared to marry Robert Carr. The English public recognized the blatant corruption immediately. The moral authority of the royal court was severely damaged. One of the newly added judges, Bishop Thomas Bilson, was brutally mocked by the citizens of London. Sir Thomas Overbury watched this grotesque legal circus unfold from the sidelines. He watched his carefully constructed political machine completely fall apart. Overbury knew the stakes. If Carr married Frances, Carr would politically become a member of the Howard family. The Howards would entirely control the king's favorite. They would secure their alliance with the Spanish Empire, and they would absolutely destroy Thomas Overbury. Faced with unavoidable political annihilation, Overbury's razor-sharp mind fractured. He abandoned his usual caution. He let his immense arrogance take total control. He cornered Robert Carr in a furious confrontation within the private halls of Whitehall Palace. Surviving testimonies from the later murder trials reveal the devastating nature of this argument. Overbury did not use diplomacy. He used a verbal sledgehammer. He screamed at the king's favorite. He explicitly called Frances Howard a strumpet and a base woman right to Carr's face. Overbury then deployed his fatal weapon. He threatened Carr with mutual destruction. Overbury threatened to expose their deeply guarded secrets to the entire nation. He threatened to publicly reveal that Frances was absolutely no virgin, detailing his own role in facilitating their long affair. He threatened to publish the shady backroom financial deals Carr had been running with the king's treasury. Most devastatingly, he threatened to reveal the ultimate truth that he, Thomas Overbury, had been the true author of Carr's entire political success all along. He threatened to expose Carr as a beautiful, incompetent fraud, to drive the knife in deeper, and to permanently humiliate Frances Howard on a national scale. Overbury utilized his greatest natural skill, his writing. In early 1613, Thomas Overbury wrote and widely circulated a polished poem. It was simply titled A Wife. A good wife is a world of happiness that brings with her all the joys of life. She is a modest, pure, and silent grace. On the surface, the poem detailed the strict virtues, the profound modesty, and the moral purity required of an ideal aristocratic spouse. But in the literate, cynical world of the Jacobean court, every single lord and lady knew exactly what it was. It was not a romantic ideal. It was a blistering, targeted political attack. It was meticulously designed by Overbury to highlight the absolute filth, the deceit, and the moral corruption of Frances Howard by describing her exact opposite. It was a masterclass in passive-aggressive aristocratic warfare. It was a brilliant piece of literature, and it was the worst mistake of his entire life. By writing that poem and by openly threatening to destroy her future with Robert Carr, Thomas Overbury signed his own death warrant. Frances Howard and her powerful uncle held a quiet meeting. They recognized Overbury was a lethal threat to their dynasty and made a cold decision. He had to be eliminated, but they could not use an assassin's blade in a dark London alleyway. A sudden stabbing would spark a massive royal inquest, leading straight back to them. They had to act like sophisticated statesmen and weaponize the official machinery of the English state to destroy him legally. Fortunately for the Howard faction, the psychological groundwork for Overbury's destruction was already firmly in place. King James I already deeply disliked Thomas Overbury. The king demanded undivided devotion from his royal favorites. James was intensely jealous of the controlling bond between Overbury and Robert Carr. The king resented the fact that when he spoke to Carr, he was often merely hearing the meticulously crafted echoes of Thomas Overbury's intellect. Furthermore, the king loathed Overbury's suffocating arrogance. Overbury did not bow low enough. He did not flatter the king convincingly. He carried himself with the unbearable superiority of a man who believed he was secretly running the empire. In April 1613, the Earl of Northampton approached King James with a brilliant, seemingly benevolent proposition. Northampton politely suggested that Overbury's immense intellect was being wasted as a mere personal secretary. He proposed that the king should formally offer Overbury a highly prestigious diplomatic post. They suggested appointing him as the king's official ambassador to Russia, or perhaps as a special envoy to the court of France. King James readily agreed. To the outside observer, it looked like a massive promotion. It looked like the ultimate royal honor for a talented commoner. In reality, it was a perfectly constructed political trap. It was a lethal catch-22 designed by the most ruthless minds in England. If Thomas Overbury accepted the diplomatic post, he would be instantly exiled thousands of miles away from London. He would lose his physical proximity to Robert Carr. Without Overbury constantly whispering instructions in his ear, Carr would fall completely under the control of Francis Howard. Overbury's entire foundation of power would vanish. However, if Overbury refused the post, the consequences would be legally catastrophic. In the rigid legal structure of the Jacobean era, a subject could not decline a formal command from the sovereign. To refuse a royal appointment was a severe state crime defined as contempt of the sovereign. It directly challenged the absolute authority of the monarch. The trap was flawlessly set. But to ensure that Thomas Overbury walked directly into it, the conspirators needed an inside man. They needed someone Overbury implicitly trusted. They needed Robert Carr. The exact internal motive of Robert Carr in this moment remains debated. Many historians argue Carr was actively complicit in the plot with Francis Howard. Other scholars suggest Carr was weak, terrified, and easily manipulated, completely unaware that the trap would lead to murder. Regardless of his motives, Carr's external actions constituted an act of profound betrayal. When the royal offer of the ambassadorship was presented, Robert Carr went to Thomas Overbury in strict privacy. Carr played the role of the devoted friend. Carr vehemently urged Overbury to refuse the king's appointment. He swore that he could not survive the shifting politics of the court without Overbury's brilliant mind to guide him. Carr promised to protect his friend. He swore on their brotherhood that he would use his favor with King James to smooth things over. Carr promised to calm the royal anger. He promised to navigate the legal fallout. He swore he would keep Overbury safely by his side in London. Thomas Overbury possessed the sharpest mind in the Jacobean court. He could effortlessly deconstruct foreign treaties. But he suffered from a massive blind spot. He had entirely manufactured Robert Carr's political career. Because of this, Overbury genuinely believed he possessed total psychological control over the king's favorite. He could not fathom a reality where the puppet would cut its own strings and deceive the master. Overbury believed Carr's desperate promises. He believed his shadow kingship made him untouchable. On April 21st, 1613, Thomas Overbury stood before the authorities of the royal court. Wrapped in his unbending defiance, he formally refused the king's direct command to serve as an ambassador. The trap snapped shut with mechanical speed. When King James I was informed of the refusal, he exploded in a predictable rage. The absolute authority of the crown had been publicly challenged by an unelected commoner. The king immediately ordered Overberry's arrest. He officially charged him with contempt of the sovereign. During this terrifying crisis, Robert Carr did absolutely nothing. The king's favorite, the man who had sworn to protect him, the man who had begged him to stay, stood by in cowardly silence. He simply watched as the heavily armed royal guards surrounded his best friend. The very next day, Thomas Overbury was escorted out of the corridors of Whitehall Palace. He was placed on a secure barge and rowed down the River Thames. His destination was the most formidable structure in the entire kingdom. The barge approached the heavy water gates of the Tower of London, infamously known as the Traitor's Gate. Overberry was marched up the damp stone steps. He was handed over to the lieutenant of the tower. Overberry was not granted comfortable aristocratic house arrest. By direct orders from the King's Council, a council heavily influenced by the Howard faction, Overberry was placed under strict solitary confinement. The heavy, iron-studded oak door slammed shut. The key turned in the heavy lock. Thomas Overberry was plunged into absolute isolation. He was denied access to his personal servants. He was denied visitors. He was completely cut off from the outside world, the king, and the legal system. The brilliant lawyer from Warwickshire had been outplayed. He had been outmaneuvered by a teenage woman he had fatally underestimated. He had been betrayed by a friend he had entirely created. For King James I, this severe punishment was sufficient. The crown was satisfied, but for Francis Howard, the mere imprisonment of Sir Thomas Overbury was unacceptable. Overbury was locked away, but he was still breathing. As long as Thomas Overbury drew breath, he represented an existential threat to her upcoming royal marriage. She made a cold, calculated decision. Sir Thomas Overbury had to die. Assassinating a high-profile state prisoner inside the Tower of London was a massive logistical nightmare. The Tower was a heavily regulated military fortress, managed by a strict hierarchy of royal officials. The lieutenant of the Tower, Sir William Wadd, was a veteran servant of the crown widely considered to be entirely incorruptible. He closely monitored the daily operations and would never allow a prominent state prisoner to be quietly murdered on his watch. Francis Howard and the Earl of Northampton recognized this immovable obstacle. Instead of bribing him, they utilized their political network to legally remove him. In May 1613, the Howard faction fabricated a series of administrative charges against Sir William Wadd, leveraging their unchecked influence over King James to have the honest lieutenant abruptly dismissed. With the incorruptible obstacle completely removed, the conspirators restructured the management of the tower. They installed Sir Gervase Helwyse. Helwyse was weak-willed, heavily indebted, and easily manipulated. He owed his prestigious new position entirely to the political backing of the Howard family. He was a man who knew exactly when to look the other way, but Helwyse was merely the administrator. To execute the actual murder, Frances Howard needed a man directly inside the cell. She utilized her deep connections in the London underworld to recruit Anne Turner. Mrs. Turner was a highly successful fashion designer, famous for inventing yellow-dyed ruffled collars, but she was also deeply embedded in the shadowy networks of illicit apothecaries. Through Anne Turner, Francis officially recruited Richard Weston. Weston was a hardened individual who had previously worked as an apothecary's assistant. Leveraging Helwyse's corrupt authority, they explicitly hired Weston to serve as Thomas Overbury's solitary jailer. Weston was the only man allowed to unlock the heavy oak door. The physical infrastructure of the murder was perfectly in place. The corrupt lieutenant managed the fortress above. The dedicated jailer held the keys below. They could not use a sharp blade, so they opted for a sophisticated poisoning campaign. They designed a slow, methodical campaign of dietary torture to mimic a slow decline from a severe illness. To procure the toxins, Anne Turner hired James Franklin, a shady London apothecary. For the next 4 months, from May to August 1613, the windowless stone cell in the Tower of London became an active chemical laboratory. Richard Weston completely controlled every single item of food and drink that Thomas Overbury consumed. Weston systematically laced the prisoners' meals with a lethal variety of heavy metals and toxins. The conspiracy was brazen. Frances Howard personally sent luxurious food parcels directly to the Tower under the guise of aristocratic charity. She sent baked tarts, sweet fruit jellies, roasted partridges, and expensive wine. Almost every single item was saturated with poison before it ever reached the cell. The physiological effects on Thomas Overbury were devastating. According to later testimonies from the murder trials, the apothecaries supplied Weston with massive quantities of arsenic and real Carr. When Overbury consumed these chemicals, they violently shredded his delicate stomach lining, causing unceasing vomiting and agonizing dysentery. But the conspirators did not stop at arsenic. They introduced heavy doses of mercury into his diet. Mercury poisoning attacks the central nervous system. Overbury began to experience terrifying neurological symptoms. He suffered from uncontrollable tremors. His skin erupted in painful weeping sores. His hair began to fall out in clumps. His gums receded and his teeth loosened in his jaw. They even utilized a cruel biological toxin known as cantharides, or Spanish fly. When ingested, it ravages the human urinary tract, causing Overbury to continuously pass blood and pus in unimaginable burning agony. Sir Thomas Overbury was a brilliant man. He almost certainly realized he was being systematically poisoned. He knew his body was literally rotting while he was still breathing. In moments of desperate clarity, he begged his jailer for writing materials. He composed frantic, blood-stained letters to the one single man he believed could save him, Robert Carr. Overbury begged the king's favorite to use his influence to secure a royal pardon. He reminded Carr of their formative bond and the years of total loyalty he had provided. He pleaded for his life. The response he received remains one of the darkest acts of betrayal in Jacobean history. Robert Carr did not march to the king to demand his friend's immediate release. Instead, Carr wrote back to the freezing, dying man. He coldly told Overbury to remain quiet. He advised him to be patient and to endure the king's anger just a little longer. Most devastatingly, Carr sent along small sealed packets of medicinal powders. He promised Overbury that these expensive powders would ease the severe stomach cramps. Many historians, carefully analyzing the subsequent trial evidence, strongly argue that those medicinal powders were actively laced with even more arsenic. Whether Carr personally mixed the poison or simply allowed Frances Howard to tamper with the deliveries, his complicity in the agonizing torture of his best friend was absolute. Despite 4 continuous months of ingesting unprecedented volumes of heavy metals and exotic toxins, Thomas Overbury stubbornly refused to die. His irritated stomach constantly rejected the lethal chemicals through unceasing vomiting. Outside the thick walls of the tower, Frances Howard was in a frantic panic. Her grand royal wedding to Robert Carr was rapidly approaching, and she simply could not walk down the aisle while the brilliant lawyer was still alive to ruin her. By early September 1613, the conspirators realized the oral route of poisoning was a catastrophic failure. They needed a drastically different, much faster method that would bypass his stomach's natural reflex to expel the poison. They needed to strike directly at his most vulnerable, heavily damaged internal organs. On September 14, 1613, the conspirators made a final, ruthless calculation. They prepared a chemical cocktail so profoundly lethal that biological survival would be impossible. Thomas Overbury was already suffering from severe intestinal blockages due to the prolonged poisoning. The conspirators cruelly used this specific medical crisis as their ultimate weapon. An apprentice to a local London apothecary was granted direct access to the heavily guarded stone cell under the guise of providing standard medical relief. He carried a heavy copper tube designed to administer a blister, an enema. But the copper tube was not filled with soothing medicinal broths. It was pumped full of a highly volatile, concentrated chemical mixture. Many modern toxicologists believe the mixture contained a massive dose of corrosive sublimate, mercury 2-chloride, combined with a flesh-destroying compound such as sulfuric or nitric acid, known as vitriol. The brutal chemicals were injected directly into Thomas Overbury's rectum. This specific method entirely bypassed the natural filtering functions of his liver and stomach. The biological impact was catastrophic and utterly irreversible. The acid began to burn instantly. It melted the delicate mucosal lining of his lower intestines from the inside out, causing massive internal hemorrhaging. Simultaneously, the corrosive sublimate was absorbed straight into his bloodstream, triggering immediate neurotoxic shock to his entire nervous system. Thomas Overbury spent the night of September 14th thrashing, convulsing, and screaming in absolute agony within the echoing stone walls of the tower. By the early morning hours of September 15th, 1613, the screaming finally stopped. Sir Thomas Overbury was dead. When the corrupt jailer unlocked the heavy oak door, Overbury was found lying in a massive pool of his own blood and bodily waste. The physical state of his corpse was deeply disturbing. It was severely disfigured, blistered by the chemical burns, and emitted a foul, unnatural odor. The tower guards, operating under strict orders from the corrupt Lieutenant Gervase Helwys, did not call for a formal medical inquest. They hastily, quietly buried him that exact same day in a shallow, unmarked grave within the tower courtyard. To cover their tracks, the authorities officially recorded his sudden death as a severe case of advanced syphilis. The conspiracy had worked perfectly. The Shadow King was permanently silenced. 2 months later, Francis Howard and Robert Carr were married. Carr had been formally elevated by the king to the prestigious title of Earl of Somerset. It was one of the most extravagant state ceremonies the Jacobean court had ever witnessed. King James I personally financed the celebration. For 2 full years, the brutal murder remained a dark, successfully buried secret. The Earl and Countess of Somerset ruled the English court with unquestioned supremacy. But in a royal court built on rapidly shifting favors and deep-seated paranoia, secrets are merely weapons waiting to be fired. By the year 1615, Robert Carr had grown unbearably arrogant. He began openly mistreating other powerful nobles. Crucially, his physical beauty was fading, and his emotional influence over King James I was visibly slipping. The king's wandering eye had found a new captivating favorite, a handsome young man named George Villiers. Sensing Carr's extreme political vulnerability, his long-standing enemies finally struck. Sir Ralph Winwood, the capable Secretary of State, had caught wind of persistent rumors surrounding Overberry's convenient death. Winwood quietly, relentlessly investigated the tower guards. He eventually cornered and relentlessly interrogated the lieutenant of the tower, Gervase Helwys. The terrified, weak-willed lieutenant, realizing the political winds had shifted, eventually slipped up and formally confessed to his knowledge of the poisoned food. The truth exploded across the city of London like a powder keg. The resulting legal proceedings, known as the Great Oyer of Poisoning, became a massive media sensation. Sir Francis Bacon and Sir Edward Coke, two of the greatest legal minds in English history, were appointed to lead the royal prosecution. However, the subsequent trials rapidly laid bare the stark, deeply hypocritical reality of class privilege in 17th century England. The lower class accomplices were shown absolutely no mercy. Richard Weston, the apothecary James Franklin, the corrupt Lieutenant Gervase Helwys, and the fashion designer Anne Turner were all swiftly found guilty of murder. They were all dragged to the notorious gallows at Tyburn and hanged by the neck until dead. In a cruel twist of judicial theater, the presiding judge specifically ordered Anne Turner to be hanged while wearing the heavily starched, yellow-dyed ruffled collars she had famously invented. It was an irony that instantly ruined the fashion trend across the entire country. But the ultimate test of the nation's justice system was the masterminds. Robert Carr and Francis Howard were formally brought to trial before their aristocratic peers in the House of Lords. Overwhelming forensic and testimonial evidence was presented. They were both found entirely guilty of orchestrating the murder of Sir Thomas Overbury. The mandatory legal sentence for their horrific crime was death by execution. But King James I simply could not bear to see his former beloved favorite executed on a public scaffold. The king utilized his unquestionable royal prerogative. He formally pardoned both Robert Carr and Francis Howard from the death penalty. They were spared the executioner's axe. They spent a few comfortable years living under loose house arrest in the Tower before being officially released, living out the rest of their lives in luxury on a sprawling country estate. The historical fallout of this staggering injustice was catastrophic for the English crown. The English public watched commoners hang from the gallows for a gruesome crime that was explicitly orchestrated by wealthy aristocrats who walked completely free. This blatant double standard incited a deep, furious public outrage across all levels of society. The Overberry scandal ripped the moral mask off the Jacobean royal court. It severely damaged the foundational doctrine of the divine right of kings. The public realized with terrifying clarity that the king's justice was inherently corrupt, actively favoring the beautiful and the wealthy over the basic rule of law. Many modern historians fiercely argue that the profound distrust sown during the Overberry scandal became a vital ideological foundation. It actively fostered the explosive, anti-monarchical anger that would eventually lead directly to the bloody English Civil War just a single generation later. As for Sir Thomas Overbury, his tragic, horrific death secured him a strange, enduring sort of immortality. His poem A Wife was published posthumously, fueled entirely by the morbid public fascination with his gruesome murder and the subsequent trials. The poem became a runaway bestseller. It was continuously reprinted for decades. Sir Thomas Overbury was undoubtedly the victim of a cruel, highly calculated, and medically terrifying assassination. But the historical record also shows he was the primary architect of the very toxic, manipulative environment that ultimately killed him. He believed he was the smartest man in the room. He believed he could treat human beings as simple, unfeeling chess pieces. He genuinely believed he could manage a king and quietly run an entire empire from the shadows without any consequence. In the end, he was outplayed by a teenage woman he fatally underestimated. He was betrayed by a political puppet he had entirely manufactured. And he was destroyed by the absolute unchecked power he had spent his entire life desperately seeking to control.